All right, then, here we are. So let's get everything back together again. So, yes, we're still talking about we're still looking into international monetary systems throughout history. So let me go get the slides open. This is 19 that we're looking at now. Now, by the way, let me just go to Blackboard for a second. I just want to double check something. So 19 is definitely here. You know what? Oh, there's 18. All right, so I had planned on putting in here. I guess I didn't quite get it done. So, all right, so here's what we need to do. I have to post the chapter 18 problem set. Oops. All right, well, I guess I have to write the chapter 18 problem set. And then, all right, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to, between now and Friday, or let's say Friday night, my plan is to post a chapter 18 problem set. Now, keep in mind, it's hard to believe. It just suddenly dawned on me. I'm pretty sure that next week is our last class. And so that being the case, we have to review on the last night. So we're going to have to cover the chapter 18 problem set. There isn't one for 19. There's one for 18, but I didn't post it yet because it's not ready. And also, of course, there has to be a sample final. So I want to go through them and make sure everything is set up correctly before I post them. But I'll make sure that they're ready by Friday night, so you have the whole weekend to look at them. And then next week, what we'll have to do is, cover our final sample final and our chapter 18 problem set so that you'll be ready for the actual final, which I can give to you next week. And then I'll have to figure out how much time I can give you. But if I give it to you next week, I'm pretty sure you'll have a minimum of 1 week to do it. And so that's what I want you to have, a minimum of a week to work on it. So in the meantime, what we're going to do is get back to 19 and look at more discussion about our historical monetary systems, which may actually be helpful to you if you choose one of those topics for your paper. So we'll figure that out. But like right now, let's just get back to the notes. Okay, now I've been searching and I've found more and more really nice videos to help us supplement what we've been doing here. So we want to first get back to the notes, and then as called for, we'll watch through relevant videos. So let's see, where did we leave off? We were looking at, oh, wait a minute. Okay, I have to admit, I don't remember where we left off. I believe we were talking about the gold standard. And I believe I have a list of the videos we've been watching. And so I see that we definitely covered the gold standard. We did fixed and floating exchange rates, Hong Kong's currency peg, a crawling peg, the gold standard. Bretton Woods, speculative attacks, the Asian financial crisis, and oh man, we really got pretty far. Dollarization, but we saved a lot of good stuff for this week. And so, did we start to go over the Bretton Woods? I think we must have because we watched the videos. Yeah, we watched the videos for Bretton Woods. And now here's a list of the different exchange rate regimes that the IMF recognizes. And there's 8 of them listed here. We don't have time to go through all of them, but the first one is exchange arrangements with no separate legal tender. And this one includes the case of a monetary union like the euro, but it also includes dollarization. We also have currency boards, which are a very interesting idea. I looked for videos on that one and I couldn't really find one, but we also have other variations of pegged exchange rates. In other words, a peg means you tie your currency to another currency. Sometimes you peg it like Hong Kong does at a specific rate, like 7.8 Hong Kong dollars to the US dollar, and then you just leave it there forever. But there's other possibilities too. You can have your exchange rates pegged and yet allowed to stay within a narrow band and then periodically updated to either stronger or lower levels, depending on what's going on with your economy. We also have crawling pegs, which we've seen a video about, exchange rates within a crawling peg, managed float, which basically means you have floating exchange rates, but the central bank does periodically intervene and tries to prop up the currency or in some cases weaken it. And then we have independent float, where basically the central bank keeps its hands off and does not intervene in foreign exchange markets. So we've already briefly discussed dollarization. You'll recall we watched the video from about Ecuador, but we also have a few other countries that have dollarized, such as El Salvador and Panama. Now, the one thing these countries have in common is that they're all fairly small economies, and they also do a large percentage of their trade with the United States. So in cases like these, where the economy wasn't very strong, and in fact, if anything, there's a lot of inflation and high interest rates, possibly a debt crisis, these countries decided it would be better to have the dollar than their own currency, because that would impose a lot of discipline on the domestic government as far as spending. And it would also help reduce the rate of inflation and interest rates to levels much closer to the United States. And dollarization doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it can often bring price stability to a nation, but it also means that the central bank gives up the opportunity to use monetary policy. Now, the euro, so yes, we'll talk about that in more extensively later on, but a currency board means that a country still technically is using its own currency, but it is tied directly to a foreign currency, which is known as an anchor currency. And that anchor currency is the one that is essentially giving the domestic currency its credibility. Now, a perfect example of this is Argentina. In 2001, let's see, I don't have that here. Well, all right, let me tell you about it. In 2001, well, actually, not 2001, in the 1900s, let me toss this in here. In the early 1990s, Argentina adopted a currency board after experiencing high rates of inflation and high interest rates. The currency board was set up so that each peso in the economy could be exchanged for US dollars on a one-to-one basis. So in other words, if you lived in Argentina at this time, any peso that you had in your pocket, you could take it over to the central bank and they would give you $1 for each peso that you held. And so the purpose of this is to increase confidence in the local currency, because this way everybody knows that, well, pesos are not the best currency in the world, but at least I'm guaranteed that I can trade them for dollars. So what do I care? As long as I can get dollars, I don't need dollars, but I can get them anytime I want to. And so it presumably provides more confidence in the country's economic system. So in order to maintain this currency board, Argentina held $1 in its reserves for each each peso in circulation. All right. So this ensured that the government, or I should say the central bank, could not run out of dollars. In other words, even if every single person in the country decided to trade their pesos for dollars, it could be done. Now that, of course, requires them to hold and get their hands on all these dollars. It does really impose a lot of constraints on the central bank and on the government. It's really, in a lot of ways, not much different than the gold standard, in the sense that with the gold standard, you can't expand the money supply beyond the gold you actually have. And here, Argentina can't realistically, could not expand the money supply any faster than it could acquire dollars. So it sounded like a good setup. Now, keep in mind, though, that this is often a last resort. Countries that go to a currency board usually are in a lot of trouble already. And so what happened with this one is it worked well for a while. The problem with it, though, is this. During this period, the dollar was unusually strong, which meant that Argentina's peso was also very strong. So remember, if it can be traded one-to-one with the dollar, the Central Bank of Argentina is guaranteeing, if you happen to find yourself with dollars, and that includes foreigners, by the way, you can always trade them in for dollars. So for all practical purposes, the peso is trading on a one-for-one basis with the dollar. So this strongly discouraged exports, and which was a real problem, extremely harmful to Argentina's economy. As a relatively large percentage of Argentina's GDP comes from trade. Okay, it's not like the US, where trade is important, but it's not nearly as important as it is in a lot of countries where their survival really depends on trade. And so this Argentina was getting squeezed by the strength of the peso. And then on top of that, in addition, Argentina held a significant amount, well, not held, owed a significant amount of foreign debt, much of which was denominated in dollars. Okay, now that's a problem, because as the dollar's getting stronger, that implies that the Argentine government has to be prepared to put up more pesos for each dollar debt. So they were finding themselves owing. The government had to spend a huge percentage of its budget servicing the debt. When the recession of 2001 hit, the government of Argentina ran out of money to pay its foreign debts, and it defaulted on them. Now, that's a disaster for a country. I mean, it's a disaster for anyone when you suddenly find yourself unable to pay your debts. But with a government, well, all right, well, with a corporation, at least you have the option of declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy and trying to rebuild your position and maybe restructuring your debts and somehow being able to survive. And so with the government, though, when a government defaults on its debts, it usually renegotiates them with the creditors through the World Bank. Usually the World Bank comes in and they take over and they say, like, all right, everyone, here's what we're going to do. We're going to figure out how to get everybody as much money as possible. And they often lend the defaulting country money too to help them get back on its feet. And so but the problem is the investors ultimately do lose money. And the defaulting country finds it hard or impossible to borrow more money as a result. In other words, from that point on, nobody in their right mind is going to buy Argentina's bonds, all right, because they know what just happened. They're like, well, where am I throwing away my money? So they, of course, being Argentina, also had massive budget deficits that had to be covered. So they were running into a lot of problems. And so the currency board had to be abandoned. And so the peso was allowed to float freely. Immediately, the peso crashed from 1 peso per US dollar to 4 pesos per US dollar. Now that means that this resulted in far higher import prices. And of course, they're buying important things like they're getting a lot of their oil from abroad, they're getting food, etc. So their import prices are rising dramatically, higher inflation, higher interest rates, and more unemployment. And so you can see it was a mess. Now, eventually, they gradually, in small stages, were able to dig themselves out of this hole to a certain degree. But the fact that they had to give up the currency board was a huge blow to their pride and their prestige and everybody's confidence in Argentina. So, this kind of system can work well for a while, but the problem is that there was just so overloaded with debt to start with. And then, of course, there was a recession, which is no fault of their own. And of course, a lot of their traditional export markets dried up because their currency had gotten so strong due to its association with the dollar. So it was not a terribly happy ending, but it does show us what one other potential exchange rate system that could be used to maybe meet the needs of a particular country. You don't see these very often, but it does occasionally happen. And so that was the most recent example that I can think of a currency board. Now, Hong Kong has a fixed exchange rate, but it's not a true currency board because I don't believe there's any implicit guarantee that you can trade your Hong Kong dollars for US dollars. So it's really more, strictly speaking, a fixed exchange rate. All right. Now there's other arrangements as well. A country may peg its currency to a foreign currency without having to have a currency board. And in that case, the exchange rate, as we've already seen, is maintained by the central bank through interventions in the foreign exchange market or through domestic open market operations. The bottom line is that um, you've got to keep your currency fixed at a certain rate. Otherwise, nobody will take you seriously. In other words, the success of something like this depends very heavily on people believing that it will continue to work into the future. If traders, for example, are convinced that you're about to abandon your peg, they can, let's just say that can lead to problems because they can try to sell your currency and try to earn profits at your expense, and that can make things a lot worse. Now, yeah, and the Chinese currency, we're going to see more about that later on, but the Chinese yen was pegged to the US dollar at a rate of 8.28 per dollar. And then they started to come under pressure from their trading partners who thought that was pegged at a rate that was a little too weak, which gave them a competitive edge in their exports. And the other countries felt like that was an unfair advantage. So in small stages, China revalued their currency, meaning that they raised the official fixed exchange rate until it's up now in around 6, maybe. Let's see. Let's go find out. Okay, it says here it's only 8. When was that written? Oh, so it says here the yen will be revalued to 8.11 per US dollar. I thought it was lower than that. Previously, it had been pegged at 8.28 per US dollar, where it had been almost unchanged since the Asian crisis of 97-98, which somebody may want to write about. Oh, for God's sakes, look at this. This is an old article. No wonder. No, that can't be right. All right, this is going back to last Christmas time. Let's see, where is it? No, I'm not seeing it. Why is this so hard? There it is. I knew it. For example, China's 2015 modification to its exchange rate allowed the yen's value to fall from just over 6.1 yen per dollar at the beginning of 2015 to just under 6.4 in September of that year. And so that's quite a bit down from 8.28. And so the idea was that, under pressure from their trading partners, they slowly strengthened it so that they wouldn't have such an unfortunate, or I should say unfair edge, as the others saw, in their dealings with the rest of the world. Now, it just so happens, while we're talking about this, I happen to have a video which I stumbled onto today about China and the fixed exchange rate. So while we're on this subject, maybe we should just check it out right now. So let me go get my hands on that video. And then let's check this out. All right. Now, as it turns out, the video is really more about China itself than the actual exchange rate. So, maybe I was a little disappointed in this thing, but it's still well worth watching, in my opinion. So it's called "Why Does China Manipulate Its Own Currency?" So why don't we check this out? All right, let's do this.
My name is Daisy Robinson. As a scientist, to a radically different market system than the US, it is almost inevitable that this nation has just a great opportunity still ahead. Perceived threat, true or otherwise, has led to hostilities like the US China trade war. shows, having something like a Honda was actually a pretty serious flex. I, up their own exchange where everybody and anybody can come in and trade 5 RMB. Let's say you were planning a trip to Shanghai and you need to exchange some American dollars to RMB to pay for everything. More RMB for every $1. You totally get stuffed because you just don't.
All right. Well, that was kind of interesting. Um, yeah, because of course China's whole strategy has been to grow like crazy, and by doing that, by exporting goods and services to everyone in the world, especially the U.S. And so they're willing to do whatever it takes to get that done, even if they have to spend a lot of money maintaining the fixed exchange rate peg. They're willing to do that because they really see their future as catching up with us, and that's the only way it's going to happen, by growing, and that in turn will happen mainly through trade. Now, I think last week we watched a video about Venezuela and dollarization. Since then, I found another really excellent video about the situation in Venezuela, which I think I would like to show you now, just because it ties in very nicely with what we were doing last week. So let me fire that over to you, and I'm sure you'll like this.
50,000
So yeah, in small stages, although it's not officially dollarized, you can see that everybody in Venezuela is using dollars because they have no confidence at all in their own currency. And so anytime a country has a lot of inflation or a very weak currency, or if they have a particularly harsh government, which tries to interfere with every aspect of their lives, you often see the people resorting to other currencies. Usually it ends up being the US dollar. And so, illegal or not, people are going to use dollars because that's really the only way they can survive. And so, like the people in the video were complaining that, wow, we get paid in bolivars and then everything is priced in dollars. What are we supposed to do? So often these situations end up squeezing the middle class very, very hard because, like they said, they're getting paid in a very rapidly depreciating currency, and then their expenses are in the dollar, which is of course very, very strong. So what they'll do is, that one person wouldn't be on the camera. They knew that they might get arrested if they were seen trading in dollars, because technically that's illegal in Venezuela. But of course, everybody ignores that because they need to survive. So and that is referred to as a black market because it's technically illegal, but everybody's doing it because their own currency is almost worthless. And it's not the only place you see that. Cuba has the same thing. They've always had black markets because theoretically using dollars is illegal, but of course nobody's going to stop them. The police can't arrest everybody. Let's put it that way. And so, of course, if you travel throughout the Caribbean, a lot of those countries like the Bahamas and Bermuda, they also have not officially dollarized, but they may as well because their currency, their economies are more or less entirely dollar based. Every transaction you make pretty much is done with US dollars. And so for all practical purposes, those economies have dollarized, but unofficially, of course, because their own currency still exists. All right. Anyway, so now that raises an interesting question. Why exactly is the dollar so powerful in the first place? So we're going to see a video that addresses exactly that question. Why is this happening? What is so special about the dollar? All right. So let's check this out. I know you'll like it. All right. Let's look at this thing.
You know this.
All right. Well, that was pretty interesting. But now I found this other video, which you'll be surprised when you hear the title. Um, it actually ties together very nicely a lot of the topics we've been going over. But the specific title of this video is How Kuwait Created the World's Most Valued Currency. And what are they referring to here is that the Kuwaiti dinar costs over $3. So the question is, how did this happen? And so along the way, as they're discussing this interesting idea, they bring together a lot of the topics that we've already been looking at in this chapter. So let's check this one out. And I think, again, you'll find this to be extremely interesting. Okay, here we go. Let's find out about the Kuwaiti dinar.
revenue comes from petroleum-based products. Before, an issue with paying currency is that your currency is only as strong as the currency you're pegged to.
All right. All right, so we can get back to the slides now. I think you'll agree that those were very interesting videos, though, and gives you a better sense of what other types of exchange rate systems are in place throughout the world, besides just straight ahead floating exchange rates like we have. So, what other arrangements are there? Well, a country can peg its currency to a foreign currency, as we've seen, without having a currency board. Like I said, currency boards are actually quite rare these days. A peg simply means the central bank commits itself to intervening in foreign exchange markets as needed in order to keep its currency from getting too strong or too weak. So we've already seen that, for example, the Kuwaiti dinar is pegged to the US dollar. That's why, and of course, once you peg it, you can decide for yourself at what rate you want to peg it. I mean, there's nobody going to tell you you must do it at a rate of, let's say, 1 to 1 or 2 to 1. That's up to you. But if you keep it too far away from its proper value, then the central bank will have to spend all of its time and energy defending the currency because it'll be constantly having to make adjustments. So usually when there's a fixed exchange rate, there's an attempt to keep it at a level that makes economic sense. And of course, we know Hong Kong has successfully pegged its dollar to the US dollar for many decades, actually, at a rate of 7.8 Hong Kong dollars to the US dollar. And so, of course, the exchange rate is maintained by the central bank through interventions in the foreign exchange markets directly, where they jump in and either buy or sell foreign currencies, or else they can accomplish the same objectives through domestic open market operations, because then what happens is the domestic interest rate changes, and that, of course, affects its currency directly. If they need to strengthen their own currency, they'll raise domestic rates. And if they need to weaken the domestic currency, they'll, of course, lower interest rates. And sometimes this is why currency crises arise, because if you're a central bank trying to defend a currency that's getting very weak, you may have to raise your interest rates to really high levels to maintain the fixed exchange rate, but then you may be causing a recession in your own economy. And so, in a lot of cases where countries were forced to abandon their peg, it's because their currency was depreciating very quickly, and the central bank just couldn't justify keeping it in place. And so a lot of them, and when they do, the only problem is when fixed exchange rates are removed, often the currency depreciates very, very quickly, and that can lead to a lot of domestic inflation and unemployment. So anyway, the central bank, oh, okay, this is what China was doing. Then we can have, for countries like Hungary and Romania after World War II, this is how they decided to reestablish their own currencies once they broke away from the Soviet Union. The idea was that they weren't absolutely sure what their currencies were really like, worth in the real world, free from communism. And so they decided to have fixed exchange rates, but set up in such a way that they could be adjusted periodically to adjust to market realities. So they set up what's called a pegged exchange rate with horizontal bands, where they allow first the currency to fluctuate up and down within a certain range, and then on top of that, they had the ability to revalue the currency or devalue it as they saw fit. Okay, now for most of these countries, once they became free of the Soviet Union, their economies were basically a shambles. And so they all had a lot of inflation, they had a lot of unemployment. So basically, the pegged exchange rate gave them the ability to depreciate or devalue their own currency in small stages without having it happen all in one shot, which would have led to a crisis in itself, because then everybody in the world would sell those currencies, and before you know it, the currency could collapse. So basically, this is a good way to adjust a pegged exchange rate system, and also to allow it a certain amount of flexibility, as opposed to keeping it at a specific level like the Hong Kong dollar. Crawling pegs are set up in advance so that every so often they either move up or down according to a predetermined formula. And so this happens to be very useful when, let's say, a country chooses to peg its currency to another currency that has a much lower inflation rate. Like I said, with Hungary and Romania, if you're going to peg your currency to the dollar, well, when your inflation rate is 20 or 50%, that could eventually cause a problem. So a crawling peg makes it possible to make small adjustments over time rather than all at once. Now, Mexico had this too, but eventually they had to give it up because oil prices were collapsing, and that was their major export at the time. And so, and of course, obviously the peso is much weaker than the dollar. So having a crawling peg made it possible for Mexico to slowly devalue their currency without attracting a lot of attention from the market. It was meant to be predictable, very predictable. Exchange rates within crawling pegs. This means that you've got a band and you also have an exchange rate that can be adjusted periodically. Managed float means that, of course, the currency will fluctuate against other currencies. Its strength is determined in foreign exchange markets, but every so often, or possibly very often, the central bank will step in and intervene to keep it from rising too much or falling too much. Sometimes it's called a dirty float. It's kind of it can be a sticky situation because this can attract a lot of attention from your trading partners who might not appreciate it if you force your currency to become weaker than it is in the marketplace. And again, because that could potentially give you an unfair advantage over your trading partners with respect to the cost of your exports. So, these countries, they try to have it both ways. They'll adjust their currencies to keep their own goods competitively or very competitive in world markets without annoying their trading partners too much. All right, so the yen. Now, the Japanese central bank was notorious for many decades for artificially keeping the yen weaker than it otherwise would have been. And what was the point of that? To keep their exports as attractive as possible. And so they were constantly annoying their trading partners who would periodically threaten them by saying, listen, if you don't stop doing that, we're going to impose tariffs on your products. And so it led to a lot of tension between Japan and its trading partners. But fairly recently, they gave up this practice, and now they're more likely to let the yen fluctuate to where the proper level is. But all those decades, it was their practice to prevent the yen from getting too strong and thereby pricing their exports out of the market. Independent float, yes, this is the one. This is sometimes called a free float or a pure float or a clean float. The central bank allows its currency to move freely against other currencies with essentially no intervention. In other words, it's just a pure free market. The dollar, the Fed very, very rarely intervenes in foreign exchange markets unless they've been specifically requested to do so by other central banks. A recent example was in 1994, the Mexican peso was in danger of collapsing because oil prices were falling so quickly, and the Bank of Mexico asked the Fed to help them step in and prop up the peso by buying pesos and selling dollars. And by doing that, they were able to prevent the peso from completely collapsing. And then fairly soon afterwards, it started to recover. And then, of course, oil prices started going back up. And pretty soon the peso was fairly strong again. But at that critical moment, if the Bank of Mexico and the Fed hadn't stepped in, there's no way of telling how weak the peso could have gotten. And of course, sometimes what happens is when there's a currency collapse like that, it leads to a lot of political instability. And let's just say that they decided to intervene to make sure that this never happened. All right, so now fixed versus flexible exchange rates. As we've seen, the Bretton Woods system was a system of fixed exchange rates. At that point in time, it wasn't that unusual for countries to have fixed exchange rates. Now, almost all exchange rates are floating, or at least at the very least, they're allowed to fluctuate in the marketplace. We know that fixed exchange rates can lower domestic inflation, which helps stimulate trade, but it also requires the central bank to hold a significant quantity of foreign currencies or foreign exchange reserves to defend the currency just in case there's a problem. Fixed exchange rates can also be subject to what we call speculative attacks, where foreigners sell that country's currency, forcing the government or the central bank to buy it back to keep it from collapsing. And in the process, they could lose a large amount of their foreign exchange reserves, and they also could eventually run out. And then at that point, they would have to give up the pegged exchange rate or the fixed exchange rate. Also, they may need to be adjusted periodically to reflect current economic conditions, and that can be very disruptive to the economy. And of course, finally, they also eliminate, as we've seen with the AA and DD curves, they eliminate the possibility of conducting an independent monetary policy. All right, so now flexible exchange rates do not require any central bank intervention at all. So holding foreign exchange reserves is completely unnecessary. And of course, we maintain complete control over our monetary policy. Balance of payments, deficits, and surpluses can be changed or corrected through changes in the value of the currency with no need for government intervention. Because if we have deficits, we should theoretically have a weaker currency, which stimulates our exports and reduces imports. Theoretically, I'm saying, not in practice, because as we know, the US constantly has balance of payments deficits, and yet the dollar never seems to depreciate because of it. But in principle, if a country keeps running up current account deficits, their currency should depreciate, which should stimulate their exports enough to help offset these deficits. But on the other hand, when currencies are floating freely, they can be very, very volatile. And that can discourage international trade. It can also lead to higher unemployment and inflation. So, and especially countries that are prone to having relatively high inflation rates, flexible exchange rates can contribute to the problem, whereas fixed exchange rates impose a lot of discipline on the domestic government. And in fact, studies have shown consistently that countries that have flexible exchange rates on average tend to have more volatile inflation rates, and they also tend to have higher inflation. In other words, inflation is higher and more volatile. Again, it's that lack of self-discipline that's, the governments just don't have. All right. So now some of this we've already discussed, the experience of Argentina and Ecuador with dollarization and currency boards. So I'll tell you what, why don't we stop right here and have our break, and then we'll discuss this when we get back. And then what I'd really like to do is get more deeply involved in the euro, discussing the euro, okay? Because that's really an extremely interesting and important topic, and you may have chosen to write about it for your papers. And I just want to mention that having a monetary union like that with 19 members is unprecedented in world history. It had never been attempted before. In fact, usually currency unions had maybe 2 or 3 countries and that was it. Here, all of a sudden, you've got 19. So the jury's still out whether it can last, but so far, so good. It looks like it's going to be successful. But there's always threats to its stability as well. All right, so we'll stop here, and when we come back, we'll take a look at Argentina and Ecuador one last time, and then we'll start talking about the euro. Okay. All right. So let's see what's next. All right. So it's emerging markets and exchange rate regimes. We've already kind of discussed these issues, but we may as well go through it again. These are examples that of two very different cases where Argentina chose to go with a dollar currency board rather, and Ecuador chose to go with dollarization. Okay, so we know that Ecuador's case turned out to be very successful. Unfortunately, Argentina's did not. So, of course, this was 1991. After many years of hyperinflation, Argentina adopted their currency board system, in which the peso was tied to the U.S. dollar on a one-to-one basis, and that meant the pesos were fully redeemable for dollars, and it did work for a while. Inflation did fall, interest rates fell, and for a while it appeared to be a very good system. But of course, we know what happened to it. The dollar kept getting stronger and stronger. Argentina's exports became less competitive, and there was a major recession in South America in 1999, and of course that was contributing to it. And of course the Russian crisis in 1998, when what happened there is that Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, announced to the world that he would not honor the debt issued by the Soviet Union. Okay, now of course, communism officially fell in the Soviet Union in 91. And so up to that point, of course, they had a lot of debt. Once it became Russia, Boris basically said, that's Soviet era debt. We don't have to pay that. We're Russia. We're not the Soviet Union. And that caused a complete collapse of all bond prices throughout emerging markets throughout the world, because everybody figured, well, if the Russians can do this, why can't other emerging markets do the same thing? So Brazil, which also had a peg between the real and the dollar, had to eliminate their peg, and the real collapsed. And since Brazil was the major purchaser of Argentina's goods and services, that contributed even more to the recession that was brewing in Argentina. And then, of course, the big thing was that they were just overwhelmed with debts, which they had to pay, and many of them were in foreign, denominated in dollars and other foreign currencies. So their debt load became unsustainable, and eventually they had to give up. And anyway, so the currency board was eliminated after the default, and the peso immediately plunged in value from 1 peso per dollar to 4 per dollar. And of course, what that does is it massively increases domestic inflation. And so eventually, though, their trade balance started to improve again after removing the link with the dollar. And so they did have a nice comeback there, although unfortunately, very recently in 2020, they once again had to default on their debts, mainly because of their excessive foreign debt. I mean, unlike, like I said before, with a private company, they could declare bankruptcy and be rid of it. A sovereign government can't do that. Whatever debt they accumulated, they have to keep paying it. And so, once again, Argentina finds itself unable to cover its deficits. All right, now, how about Ecuador? Well, they went through a massive period of inflation. Their inflation rate was in the double digits. In fact, it got close to 100% in the late 90s. At the time, now Ecuador, you may not realize it, is a major oil exporting country. But at that time, oil prices were extremely low. And they also had a banking crisis. They had a lot of political turmoil, and they also defaulted on their debts. So they said, you know what, here's what we're going to have to do. Let's adopt the dollar as our official currency. So they traded their own currency, the sucre. 25,000 sucres was replaced by $1. And we know that after this happened, inflation and interest rates fell off dramatically, and growth did bounce back very quickly. And they're also able to negotiate their foreign debts. Now, as we saw in the video, though, the president of Ecuador, unfortunately, was deposed after this happened, which is too bad because he was really responsible for all of this. But that's all right. He has a cushy teaching job at Harvard, so I guess everything turned out okay for him. And of course, the main drawbacks to dollarization are, once again, the loss of independent monetary policy. They also lose the ability to act as a lender of last resort because they don't control the money supply. And Yeah, and this seigniorage is what happens is when a government or a central bank issues currency, they make a profit from it because the profit equals the difference between the value of the currency and the cost of actually printing it. And so this is a source of important revenues for many small countries, but small countries who dollarize obviously lose out on this. So, so like even if the Fed issues money to lend reserves to the banking system, the interest earned in those reserves is a profit for the Federal Reserve Bank. Anyway, and so like I said, for small countries, this can actually be a major source of revenues, but they lose that if they choose to go through dollarization. Now, here we go, the euro. We haven't had a chance to talk about this yet. As you know, the euro was created in January 1999. At the time, it only had 11 members, and they all sacrificed their own currencies to create a new national currency, supranational currency called the euro. So, originally, they had 11 members, as I said, and you can see them listed there: Austria, Belgium, Finland, France, and Germany. And then we also had Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. Now, Greece applied, but they were turned down because they had too much debt, which is kind of ironic because a few years ago, they very nearly were booted out for having too much debt again. So, but we'll see a separate video about that. But in the meantime, we have 11 members. Now, in the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Sweden, the public didn't want to join, although it was a close call. As I remember in the UK, the vote was very close, but all three countries turned down membership in the EMU. It was a bit of a close call. Now, in Britain, the voters basically just did not want to be so closely tied with the continent, as they call it, or the countries on mainland Europe, and they didn't want to have their monetary policy determined by bureaucrats in Brussels, and so they turned it down. And Denmark and Sweden also decided that they would stay independent and not become members. Greece desperately wanted to join, but they failed to qualify. Now, later on, of course, they did join. They got their debt a little bit more under control, and they're able to rejoin or get right in there. I think they became the 12th member. Yeah. So after being turned down the first time, about 2 years later, they managed to get in, although even then it was a close call. So then, let's see, we have Slovenia, Cyprus, and Malta, not exactly big countries. Slovakia, January 2009, Estonia. Oh, okay. I have to update this because since then we've had two more new members, which I believe are Latvia and Lithuania, but let's find out. Here we go. I'm looking for a chart. There were 11 initially. Here we go. This one is going by, let's see. Here we go. All right, so we can look at it in chronological order. Yeah, that's what I figured. After Estonia in January of 14, I'm just going to add this right now, Latvia became the 18th member. And in January 15, Lithuania became the 19th member. So there we are right now as things stand. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of people always thought that the former communist countries would join, like Poland and Romania and Hungary, but they never did. I guess they were so used to being told what to do by the Soviets that they decided that they would like to remain independent. So to this day, they haven't made any effort to join, and they may never join. In fact, if you notice, a lot of these countries, really, ever since Greece, most of these new countries are actually relatively small. But here they are, and now they all use the euro as their common currency. There may not ever be any new members. We don't know. And in fact, there have often been rumors that some of these countries might actually have to leave, Greece in particular, but also Italy, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. There have been rumors about them too. Let's see. So the members share a common currency as well as monetary policy, which is carried out by the European Central Bank in Brussels. And this all came about as a result of a treaty called Maastricht, which set out the conditions under which the countries could join the EMU. Now, Maastricht, I think, is in the Netherlands. Let me confirm that. It's in the Netherlands. I called it. I think that double A was a dead giveaway. Yeah. All right. Anyway, so what are the good things about having a common currency? Well, obviously, it eliminates all foreign exchange risk between the countries. It used to be that, obviously, if you did a lot of trade with each other, you were constantly having to deal with foreign exchange. And this way, we get rid of that problem. So there's no volatility, of course. There's easier integration of financial markets. It's easier, for example, for French citizens to buy German stocks and vice versa. There's more fiscal discipline imposed on the inflation. The members that tend to have inflationary policies, like Italy, for example, it's harder for them to inflate the currency because they don't really control it. And then, of course, the drawbacks, as you could probably guess, loss of independent monetary policy, and it also makes it harder for them to carry out an independent fiscal policy. Okay, because they're required to keep their interest rates and inflation rates within certain levels in order to stay in the eurozone. Okay, now euro currencies. This is a little bit different. This is a market which we've discussed before, but this is the market where one country keeps deposits, or anyone can keep their own currency in a deposit in a foreign bank, and when they do that, these are referred to as euro currency deposits. Deposits held initially by the Soviet Union and other communist countries were held in banks in Western Europe, and they were worried about keeping their dollars in the United States because they knew that eventually the U.S. might decide to confiscate their deposits to help pay for any problems caused by these countries, such as unpaid World War II debts. The interest that applies to them, of course, is still LIBOR, although that, as we know, that won't last too much longer. The London Interbank Offer rate is the interest rate at which the major multinational banks lend funds to each other in the London market. And so this is how they would set it up. There's an organization called the British Bankers Association that was responsible for this. And so every day at 11 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, an average of the interbank offer rates among the 16 banks was chosen. And they would toss the largest and the smallest numbers, and they would average out the rest of them to come up with that LIBOR rate. Now, LIBOR rates are available not just for dollars. You can have euro yen, you can have euros actually, and the euro Swiss franc, but they were available for all these different currencies for maturities out to 1 year. And of course, we know that they're going to disappear very, very soon. All right. Now, I did say before we have some excellent videos here about the euro and its creation. So let's check this out. All right. First, we have the euro explained. All right. Let's do that. All right. Let's watch.
Hello, welcome to this tutorial video where we explain the euro. This video is going to split down into three sections. The first one is called macro.
All right. Well, now you have that background. And so now we got one more that we can look at right now.
And they are very much a series, with each denomination just a fun camera on their own design.
All right, well, that was kind of fun. But that was, of course, not related to the formation of the euro, but it was interesting anyway. So, all right. Anyway, so I think we're done here now. So I've just been able to rustle up and find the chapter 18 problem set, but I'm still working on that sample final, but I'll make sure you have it in time to work on it over the weekend. So what I'd like to do next week is work on the chapter 18 problem set, and then also, of course, the sample final, and because that's our last class, and then I will post the actual final and make sure you have a minimum of a week to do it. But if I find any other fun videos relating to what we've done here, I'll go and put them up as well, so that when we're done, we'll be pretty much experts on currencies, and you'll also, like I said, have plenty of time to wrap up your final exam. So anyway, so I'll see you all next week. Have a good weekend.
Have a good one, Professor.
Have a good
All right.
night, Professor.
Okay.
Thank you.
All
Have a
right.
good
Bye.
weekend.
Have a good weekend, Professor.
Bye.